The thing outside my house used my brother's voice, and the worst part is that my brother was standing right next to me. I was out on the family land, just doing the usual evening sweep. You know the place, 50 acres of thick brush and rolling hills, nothing but fence lines and old cattle trails. The sun was dipping low, turning everything that dusty, hazy orange that usually makes me feel at home. I've walked those trails 1,000 times. I knew exactly which branches would scrape my jacket and where the ground got soft. But that afternoon, the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I stopped by the creek bed to adjust my boot, and that's when I heard it. A voice from the tree line, plain as anything. It was my brother calling my name, sounding bored. I shouted back before I even thought about it. After that evening, it didn't just stop. It changed. That's what messed with my head the most. The way it never repeated the same trick twice. One night, I was out on the porch, and I heard my neighbor, old Mr. Miller, asking for help with a gate down the road. His voice had that exact, wet rasp from 40 years of smoking. I almost stepped off the deck until I remembered he'd been in the hospital for a week. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just a lack of noise. It felt like the world had been muted by a heavy, invisible wool blanket. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that seemed way too loud for the stillness. I didn't see a shadow move. I didn't hear a single twig snap. But I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that something was standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching the way I breathed. Every time I looked away and looked back, the space between the trees felt smaller, tighter, like the forest was leaning in toward me. My stomach knotted, a cold weight settling deep in my gut, but I couldn't bring myself to run. I just stood there, paralyzed, straining to hear anything over the thudding of my own pulse. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, heavy and patient. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the crickets started up again. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving me shivering in the dark. I tried to convince myself I was just losing my mind from exhaustion. I stayed inside mostly, kept the curtains drawn, and told myself that a few days of solid rest would fix whatever glitch was happening in my brain. But sleep didn't come. Not the real kind. I'd drift off and wake up seconds later, or what felt like seconds, only to find the clock had jumped 4 hours ahead. I'd be standing in the kitchen with a glass of water in my hand, staring at the sink, with no memory of getting out of bed. The time loss was the part that truly started to erode my confidence. You don't realize how much you rely on the linear flow of minutes until they start to fray at the edges. I'd blink and the sun would be on the opposite side of the house. I started checking the carbon monoxide detectors, convinced there was a leak, some logical chemical reason for why my head felt like it was filled with gray static. There was this constant, high-pitched ringing in my ears, too, like the sound of a distant power line buzzing in the rain. I'd catch myself holding my breath, listening for a sound that I knew shouldn't be there. And sometimes, I'd hear it. A soft, wet inhalation that didn't belong to me, coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. I'd whip my head around, heart ready to burst, but there was never anything there. Just the empty air and the feeling of being cataloged, like a specimen pinned to a board. My reflection in the hallway mirror started to look wrong, too. Not different, just unfamiliar. Like I was looking at a photograph of a stranger who happened to wear my clothes. I told myself it was just the stress of the isolation. I was desperate for it to be a medical problem, because the alternative felt like it was already inside the house with me. I couldn't live with the maybe anymore, so I started digging. I spent nights hunched over my laptop, scrolling through the deep, dusty corners of paranormal forums and old local archive boards. I wasn't looking for ghost stories. I was looking for a match, and I found them. Dozens of threads, some years old, some from just weeks ago. The details were so identical it made my stomach drop. People from the Appalachian Trail to the high deserts of Arizona were describing the exact same thing. The familiar voices, the crushing silence that precedes the encounter, and the chilling patience of something that doesn't chase but simply waits. They all shared the same warning, written in frantic, all-caps responses: "Do not acknowledge it." Eventually, I hit a thread with a single word that made the air in my room feel like ice: Skinwalker. Seeing it written down made everything click into a terrifying focus. It wasn't a myth to these people. It was a diagnosis. I read through the accounts until my eyes burned, and every single story followed the same grim trajectory. There were no happy endings. There were no stories of people who successfully drove it away. There were only stories that stopped mid-sentence, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and a voice that didn't belong to the owner anymore. That's when the fear changed shape. It wasn't just a frantic reaction to a strange sound anymore. It was a cold, clinical understanding of a process. I realized this wasn't some random fluke of geography or bad luck. It was a selection. I looked back at my life, the way I lived alone on this land by choice, the way I found a dangerous comfort in the isolation, and that ingrained habit of shouting back to the woods whenever the wind sounded like a syllable. I was the perfect target. The stories all pointed to the same thing. These entities target people who feel a little too comfortable in the silence. People who have forgotten the primal, biological reasons why we should be afraid of the dark. I replayed every single time I had ever answered back. Every hello. I tossed into the shadows when I heard a branch snap. Every "Who's there?" I'd muttered when the floorboards creaked. I hadn't been being brave. I'd been being a teacher. I had been providing it with coordinates. Every response was a tiny piece of permission I didn't even know I was granting. My behavior shifted into a state of total, vibrating paranoia. I stopped using names out loud: mine, my brother's, anyone's. I didn't want to provide it with any more vocabulary to use against me. I draped heavy towels over every mirror in the house because I couldn't stand the thought of something studying how my eyes moved or how my mouth shaped vowels. I lived in a self-imposed tomb of silence, terrified that any sound I made would be another lesson for the thing waiting outside. But the most disturbing part wasn't the silence. It was how quickly the terror became a chore. I wasn't shaking anymore. I was just profoundly tired. Fear became a routine, a set of boxes to check, like locking the doors. I had adjusted to the nightmare. That's the real horror, the way the human mind can normalize the impossible just to keep from shattering. It wasn't a crisis anymore. It was just how I existed. It happened at 3 in the morning. I was vibrating with exhaustion, that kind of deep, aching fatigue where your bones feel heavy and your thoughts are just a dull hum. The house was dead quiet. Then, from right behind the front door, I heard myself. It wasn't a recording. It was the exact, resonant vibration of my own voice as it sounds inside my skull when I speak. It sounded desperate, small, and terrified. "Please," it said, "just let me in." In that fog of sleep deprivation, my instincts betrayed me. I didn't think about the warnings or the patterns. I just wanted the sound of my own suffering to stop. "It's open," I whispered. The second the words left my mouth, the atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted. It felt like a vacuum had been switched on, pulling the heat right out of my skin. There was no crash, no snarl, just a soft, heavy weight pressing against the other side of the wood. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a profound, hollow acceptance. I realized it hadn't been trying to lure me out. It was waiting for me to give it the last thing I had, my place. I don't know how much time has passed since I spoke. The clock on the wall has been ticking on the same second for days, and the sun is just a bruised smear on the horizon that never fades. The silence isn't heavy anymore. It's just home. I find myself sitting in the dark, not because I'm hiding, but because the light feels intrusive now. I hear the voices still, drifting through the floorboards, but they don't startle me. Sometimes they sound like me, and sometimes they sound like things I've forgotten I once loved. The scariest part isn't that the thing is in here. It's that I've stopped looking for the difference between us. I catch myself practicing the way it breathes, matching my lungs to that wet, heavy rhythm. I'm not sure whose name I'm thinking when I'm alone, and the truth is, I'm starting to prefer its version of my voice. It sounds so much more certain,